Welcome. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the St. Louis Art Museum. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this evening's Artist Talk. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. To get us started, I will pass the virtual microphone to Hannah Clem, the Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, and Simon Kelly, the Curator and Head of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, who will introduce tonight's featured guest. Thanks, Simon and Hannah.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. So I'm going to give a brief introduction before handing over to Hannah. Well, first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to the event tonight. So we're very excited to host this conversation with Oliver Lee Jackson tonight. Oliver is a leading contemporary artist who was born in St. Louis and whose work in many different media, including paintings, as you can see here, as well as drawings and prints, also in the exhibition at the moment, explores the intersection between figuration and abstraction. Oliver had a major exhibition of his work at the National Gallery of Art in Washington in 2019, and we're very happy to host our current retrospective display of his work, which covers more than 50 years from the mid-1960s until 2020. This exhibition, Oliver Lee Jackson, opened at the St. Louis Art Museum on July the 16th and runs until February the 20th, 2022. And we hope that you will have a chance to see it. There will also be a forthcoming exhibition catalogue. So with that brief introduction, let me hand over to Hannah, who will ask Oliver the first question. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon, and welcome, Oliver. We're so excited to be here with you. And I think we really just wanted to start at the beginning. Can you explain kind of when you realized that making art was something that was of interest to you? How did you start to explore what it meant to be a painter or a maker of objects or a draftsperson, etc.?
It's an interesting question. Well, I was always making things as a child, but I think your question really is, when did I accept that as something I wanted to do as sort of who I am? I think, well, that came later. During my teens, I was ambivalent about many things, and what this making was for me was unclear of what it demanded of me. So I was unclear about who I was in relation to making. When I reached my 20s, it became much clearer, but I was still unsure of what it required. What I'm trying to express is that I'd always been making something from a very, very early age, but not seeing that activity as what I would be about for well over my lifetime, let's put it like that. So that begins to really become clear in my 20s, that I would have to make some kind of internal decision to be a maker. And for me, that's not a career. It was what I needed to do and had to accept it. So it happened, I think, in my 20s, when I was struggling with that acceptance of being a maker as what I was truly about. And it was difficult, because the conflict that arose within me about this kind of devotion to it also made it difficult in the things that people consider normal, relationships, and where one expects them to go or develop is, in many cases, as a priority, is pushed aside. And it's very, very difficult to accept that, because I'm a human being and I want it all. But for me, it was not possible. Simple as that. I hope that answers sort of the question.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I guess just following on from that, Oliver, so while you were in St. Louis, you were affiliated with a group of artists called the Black Artists Group.
Right.
And can you talk a bit about the importance of BAG to arts production at that time?
Yes, it was number one. It was an exciting time period. It was at a time when, of course, the United States was in a great turmoil. The late 50s and 60s, and of course, African American people were really in a very hard place socially, and were protesting against the conditions. And it was very intense. And by intense, I mean it involved people's lives, and dedicating oneself to that kind of, let's call it a struggle, really changes you. But it's very exciting, because if you agree with the struggle for yourself against what you see as oppression, as being contained, and that's oppression in its fullest sense, to being contained and limited, then to struggle against it, you become alive in a sense. You're just very direct, you're dealing with it. Well, the participants in BAG, everybody felt that way. It's part of the times. And then what we had to bring to the table, of course, was what we were dedicated to: music and or painting and dance and all those. So when coming together with the intention to help the African American community to have access to any skills or anything that we had to offer them that had to do with painting and or dance or poetry, etc., was what we were about. And so in getting together, we all had just lots of ideas, a plethora, if you'll have it. And so it was exciting to make the exchanges, to do collaborations, and to learn each other. And in learning, what I mean is the depth of dedication of that each person in their media had for their media, so to speak. And then you gain a great respect, because it's the individual passion for it that you have, and you now are in this larger context with other people who have the same level of passion. So it was exciting. And then we were all trying to make something happen, to make change. So it was doubly exciting. Also, the risk. We were in conflict with, of course, the establishment. That, of course, was from our perspective, the very oppressive force that we saw against us. And so that made it doubly interesting and exciting. And also it was dangerous, but that was not so much of a concern, the danger of it. Was that helpful?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, to connect some of these ideas in terms of your early career in making and your time in St. Louis, were you primarily working with painting? It's interesting to hear you talk about all the different mediums, or can you talk a little bit about how you approached your work in the early years in terms of mediums, painting, drawing, sculpture?
Yes, well, sculpture was difficult to engage in because of money and place. I was working basically out of my home at the time. So I could paint and draw in a limited way. In other words, a scale of things. But I had a room that in the home that was a studio, made into a studio, and there drawing and painting was fundamentally what I was engaged with. The sculpture came later when I had the room to do it and the funds to also get more materials and tools, since a whole different set of tools are needed and materials. So it came later. So primarily, yes, painting and drawing was the means that I had at the time. Is there more? You want? I can give more. Hannah?
No, that's super interesting. I think Simon was going to follow up from that.
Yeah, so we have 3 early works in the exhibition, 2 paintings and 1 drawing, as you know, which are all connected to Sharpeville. So I guess just as context, these works are a response to the Sharpeville massacre, which took place in South Africa. I'm sure Oliver, you'll speak in a second. On March the 21st, 1960, 69 peaceful Black protesters demonstrating against apartheid were killed by South African police. So, these are works which have been fascinating to me, I think to all of us. So I wonder maybe you could talk a bit about, Oliver, about how the Sharpeville series developed, and maybe even a little about specifically about the works in the show, both the drawing and the 2 paintings.
Sure. First, the Sharpeville event was very moving because it was so similar to what was happening in the United States, in the South and in the North, to people protesting for their rights or civil access to public space. And the difference was that the state in South Africa was much more open about its oppression in terms of its response, was in many cases harsh because of the manner in which the society was divided into homesteads, homelands, so to speak. These places, for instance, in Johannesburg, there's a place called Alexandria, which is right outside Johannesburg. And it's really like a kind of reservation. And it's fully a township inside of a city, so to speak. And it's very similar to a ghetto, except it is separated in a much clearer and sharper way than in the United States. However, the embattled people were assaulted with tanks and firepower that we did not encounter in such a degree, except in the so-called riots in Watts, in which the same kind of military force was brought to bear. This is not new in the United States. Military force was brought to bear in Tulsa in the early 1900s. Airplanes bombing African-American communities. So the history in the United States is fierce, but at this time, this event really brought to me the force of the power against people who protest and the result of desperation upon desperation. The first desperation is to try to break the oppression. And in trying to break it, the force against you is trying to break your spirit. And so it's double desperation. And since your resources are limited in striking back in terms of power with power, you are always in a position where you suffer the death and mayhem, just general mayhem. And so it becomes, the word for it is, you become internally desperate and great anxiety because your life is on the line. And you're putting yourself in harm's way. And so this event mirrored the United States, but it mirrored it in a way where my intimacy with what was happening in the United States was not as clear as it should have been, because I was born here and there is a great deal of Americana that I have absorbed. And so I could not, from my perspective, see clearly this desperation that is common to all human beings that are being oppressed with harsh power. And this event was so clear to me that that's what was happening to the individuals involved. And so I used it and was inspired by it to speak to that desperation. And along with the word desperation is a sense of desolation, because you're in a modality in which all the things that a human being holds dear have no value. Your home is not sacred. Your body is not sacred. The place you call home, the place that you feel secure in, is no longer secure. And so this kind of doubles, or more than doubles, the sense of desolation and desperation. And the images then that moved me in seeing it was people running helter-skelter, so to speak, but the manner in which they were running. And I thought that those images I could use to express my feelings. And here, my feelings are not about the oppressor. It's much more about the eternal feelings of human beings when they feel desolation and despair and flee and try to, and the fleeing is to run away from that which is destructive to their humanity. So that is the reason that I was so taken by the event and felt very personal.
Interesting. Yeah.
Was there anything else, Simon, that you wanted to ask about the paintings themselves, or?
No, I mean, not really. I mean, I think, I mean, I was interested that when I spoke to Oliver recently, you actually said to me you wished you hadn't called them the Sharpeville series. So
Yes, I
maybe you
can
could
speak to that if you
speak to
want me.
that.
I can speak to why I didn't want to use it after. At first, I used it because I wanted to identify not the event, but the place, Sharpeville. The name was interesting to me too, Sharpeville. It was just interesting. And I wanted to identify it. However, the politics that developed around the name itself and the difference between the images in the painting and the event are quite separate. And so many of the people who saw the paintings were thinking much more about the event itself. And I had literally abstracted from the event what was important to me. And I thought that the images expressed that. But again, it was a title that they wanted an explanation that was not related to the images in the painting. And that's why I wished I hadn't used the name, because it was known, you know, the event was worldwide at the time. So that's the reason.
And we have 2 paintings and a drawing in the show, but the series, or the group that were inspired in some ways by these images, it's a larger group, right?
Say that again.
Paintings, there's a number of paintings.
There are more. Is that what you mean? There's more
Yes,
than,
yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yes. I think there's close to 10. and over a period of time. They don't all occur one right after the other, but they're absolutely over that 10-year period. It's like a period of digestion in which, out of this feeling that I have about this desperation, the gestures that indicate visually, hopefully for a viewer, this feeling that they may experience an effect that they grasp rather than a historic event that they have a position on, pro or con, but that something about being a human being and placed in a position where you fear for your authenticity as a human being, your legitimacy as a being that exists because of these powerful effects on you. And so over a period of time that developed, and the images began to change in terms of the gestures and forms that the paintings took.
That's so interesting. So in this time in the 60s and 70s, you also traveled a lot and you went on a few trips throughout Africa. Can you talk a little bit about some of the influences and what you got from those trips and how they can be kind of seen in some of the techniques you used in your making processes?
Yes. I traveled to Africa for a number of reasons. The most important was to go to the continent and find out how African peoples live in their own traditions, apart from a fundamental manipulation by colonial European forces. I wanted to find out what fundamental attitudes or sensibilities that we have developed as as people. So that was one of the reasons. While there, of course, engaging with the people there and being always interested in making, and the things that I saw and the manner in which making takes place and the traditions behind it really influenced me in this way. One, if one has a point of view, a feeling about something, and you want to objectify it in visual language, that is sculpture and or painting and or weaving, by making an object, then the materials that you choose must be chosen because they efficiently get across the effect that you want. And so materials were not looked upon as art materials, but necessary materials to get the effect that you want, which is very different than the training that I received in the academy, in which certain things were art materials and certain things were not at the time. And of course, that's changed to a great degree, but it's in Africa that I understood that the point was to make a harmony that was so correct that the effect that you wanted came through very clear. So if it required cloth or iron, all in one piece, wood. And it wasn't a question of assemblage, it was a question of reaching an image that did the work that it was supposed to do. And so there were no names for this bringing together of materials because that was not the point at all of the work. And that was eye-opening and freeing. I had already been using materials prior to that, but not as sure-footed about it until I went to Africa. And then I got like, oh yes, it's obvious. And so that was extremely helpful. And the attitudes about making, how they were wedded to what we could call spiritual intent on the part of the maker. Here, I'm not talking about religion, but the seriousness without the cultural rhetoric surrounding it. In other words, you're making something for let's say a cult or a group, and you take it seriously, and you know that it has to fulfill their needs. Also, that after fulfilling their needs, it is to be handled and used by them. And it continues, and this is a deep understanding, to be alive and a force. And that's really extraordinary. The belief that you have made something that has a spirit force, and that if it is dealt with by those who requested you to make it, they will continue to make it an object of power for them. That was really wonderful. I do think that many people have this concept, but it's muffled. I think it is similar to having an heirloom that you care for long after someone within your family is gone, but it's something that is like a talisman that a family may hold on for centuries or years. I think it's the same kind of activity, but it's not so much a tradition that is upfront as it is in Africa, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yes, that's really interesting.
No, I agree. I think it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to hear about your travels, and also I know that you've collected, some really interesting African art, Oliver. I guess I'm also interested in thinking about your interest in African art within the context of your broader. I think we've all been impressed by the sort of range of your knowledge of a whole variety of artistic traditions. This is a sort of big question, but are there particular artists that you admire or have been particularly influential on your work? Would you say?
That is a big question, really big.
You don't have to answer it now, but you can have to try and answer it now.
Well, the answer is yes, there are many. And it sort of works like this. You're focused on certain artists or makers out of needs, and you have an affinity for how they make things. There's for instance, the El Greco, for instance, as an example. I was attracted to the way that he's able to use certain forms that are flame-like in terms of how he makes the feel seems to be fluid, but fluid like fire. So that the figurative elements, or the cloth elements, or the animal elements, whatever the naturalistic or realistic elements are, they yield to a particular way in which he forms them so that this rhythm that is fire-like rhythm, turning on itself and rising up and flickering light, it's extraordinary. At the same time, a painter like Goya also does an interesting kind of bringing forth images up out of a field that, particularly in his later works, that is dark, and these forms come forth and they seem to grow right out of that field, and the way it pulsates and the weight that it has. For instance, in comparison between the two, a comparison between the field effects, there's a lightness in El Greco that fire has and rising, of volatility. But in Goya, there's a weightiness in which the whole world that he makes is massive and weighty, regardless of whether it is an object or simply atmosphere. And the illumination is the same way. I could go on and on. In terms of a painter like Jackson Pollock, for instance, he opens a large canvas, but it's lacy, and it opens, the field opens in this most delicate way, where forms come forth if you take time, but at the same time, they fall back into a field that is extraordinarily just beautiful, like a lace maker. And so you get a double, or not just double effect, but you get many effects that are so ambiguous that you dream the painting. It's the ambiguity between this clarity and that which presents itself like lace just between, if I'm, hope the images come through a bit, it opens me up as a viewer to a world, to experience. And the experience takes me places that mentally I cannot define, but I know by the experience and the effect of the work upon me. That was probably much too complicated.
No, it's interesting. I mean, because I mean, I think Hannah and I, we've spoken about, you can see the impact of Pollock on certain of the paintings actually in the show, I think, but I'm not sure you want to talk about particular influences, but anyway, but I think it's anyway, Hannah, do you want to ask the next question?
No, it's really interesting. And speaking of kind of media that have a long history, the show, the show has two spaces, and so there's a room of prints and drawings and a room of paintings. And we wanted to maybe ask you a few questions about the prints and the drawings. In some of our conversations, it's been interesting because you talk about how even the prints, how everything starts from drawing. So it would be great to hear you kind of talk about how you approach printmaking and what you think about prints in relationship to your practice as a whole.
Okay. First, I like drawing on copper. And the printing process is always interesting. The difference between, of course, the drawing on copper, that's one kind of image that you see, but the moment it's printed on paper, it's an exciting kind of different look that is very strong. My response to it is very strong, both the working on the copper itself and the result of the printing of the marks. Also, I was attracted to the strength of the black and white, the paper, and the inked marks. Well, in the copper, you don't get that. And then the illumination, that's the result of it. And also in the print itself, the forceful dynamics that are possible. And when I say forceful, I'm not simply talking about dramatic differences, but the subtlest marks are dramatic when the copper plate is printed. So that the drawing on it is one kind of doing, and it's resistant. It's not like a pencil sliding over paper, but it digs in. And so it requires a different manner of drawing. And when the result, however, shows in the print itself, it simply, for me, the physicality of the marks and the paper are really extraordinarily exciting. That any pressure of the mark making tool, light or deep or rough, it shows up beautifully. It reproduces the marks so well, so clear. And so that in itself is just exciting. And then the whole drawing process is of course making. You stack up, you make one mark over another until you build something you call a form or an image. And then you have to make a world. And so all the things that are a part of painting or sculpture is to make a one out of many marks, to make a image that, apart from all of the components that make the print, it should hopefully effect as a world that a viewer can experience that's unique, simply unique. And the aesthetics or the loveliness of the marks themselves, the paper itself, the physicality of it, and that it does this other work of allowing a person that's open to it to have an experience that is not the seeing, but something that happens that they possess, which is wonderful, I think.
So in addition to the prints, there's one watercolor in the show, which was part of an exhibition that you had at the St. Louis Art Museum in 1990.
Mm.
And it's interesting because you're talking about the pressure and the marks and the black and white contrast in the prints, but the watercolor is so translucent and light and different. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how you see watercolor working?
Well, watercolor is painting with water. And so whenever you use any material, you have to pay attention to what it does. Water wants to flow. It likes to spread in materials that can absorb it. One of the things is it has no real body in terms, if one thinks of oil paint or acrylic, and watercolors really have no physical body like that, but their physicality is how they receive the light when they dry, and how the illumination, as a result of the light passing through these very transparent colors, comes back and makes body. And this body now is not an illusion, it's a felt effect. So you have this almost non-substantial paint that's capable of making you feel volume and weight and mass, can be extremely airy, can turn a white page into pure atmosphere with a few marks of color. The hues are so extraordinary in their transparency, and yet they can build such solid mass out of a few marks. So it's also like drawing with water. And I only mean by that, it tempers how you, this kind of drawing, like any kind of drawing, and the copper tempers how you make the mark. Just as much as the brush with watercolor tempers how everything flows. It tempers the way you, what pressures you use. You don't need much pressure to lay a color down in this way. So everything changes, but naturally. And if you're compatible with the media, if you're not, then it's not comfortable with it. For me, it's exciting. I think it's just forceful. Oil painting, which is thought of as the queen of king of painting. But I don't think that's the case at all. It's just that watercolor has been looked upon as a minor league kind of painting. But of course, that's, need I say, the Academy. I mean, the
I
watercolor.
know you don't like the Academy, Oliver.
Well, I'm hard on the Academy for those
Yeah.
kinds of things. Watercolor is not limited in any way. There's no reason that it can't be used monumentally, and has been. It's just extraordinary works by it. But there have been divisions made between what's this and that. But that's my opinion.
I think, I mean, we see it in this watercolor, but in general in your work, one of the most striking aspects is your use of color. So maybe you can speak to that a bit. Maybe you can speak to your use of color, what that means for your practice.
Well, I learned in formal training. I won't use the word academy. I'll use formal training. Color tended to be used or thought of that which filled in shape. That was very, very fundamental to the manner in which painting is taught, particularly color, is taught in that way, so that shape and outline and all that tends to be thought of as form, and tonality is the building of form, and then the addition of color as almost an aesthetic glory, so to speak, okay? I don't think of it that way. I had to break that habit. It didn't make a lot of sense. There were concepts that black, it was not a color, nor white. That makes no sense. Of course they're colors, powerful colors, and they had been used as such. For me, what I began to understand is color in the use of painting is form. There are many ways of making form, and color is powerful in making form. And by making form, I mean the effect of a hue can be visually weight, absolutely atmosphere, illumination, all that's form. And color can do that without the aid of shape. One of the things that I think non-objective, so-called non-objective painting and so-called abstract painting showed is that with pure color, as well as the Fauves and the European tradition that broke with the kind of academic painting, showed that color itself could build powerful, formal paintings, form in the sense of form now, not formal in the sense of a diagram or something like that. So that painters like Matisse or I'm thinking of, I can't, the name, this escapes me, but they showed, Picasso, well, they showed that color can do all the work. It's not dependent on shape or the concept of tonality, light and dark, building dimensionality. It can make extraordinary dimensionality. And of course, this was understood particularly by the Venetian painters. It's one of the great, and the Northern painters in Europe, the Van Eycks and the Van der Weydens. I could go on, but the color is form. And so when I understood it, then it made me pay attention to color making. And this is important to me. Making the effect in a viewer of the deepest feelings. For me, if I, again, using El Greco, and his use of color is so different than, let's say, Caravaggio's, and therefore the feelings that they make the colors do that kind of work is extraordinary. It's unique. This is what color can do. You could pick out many different painters, European, but also in Japan and other places in which hue itself carries ambiance beyond its ability to make all kind of form, to make a field. It can also make one really feel emotions and feelings quite deeply, just the hue itself. So discovering that, then I tried to understand how a color makes me feel and shift the making of hues so that they don't have to have names. It doesn't have to be yellow. It can be nondescript, and it's a hue. And a nondescript, that is no name color, can move deeply. So you have a lot of no name colors. For instance, Rembrandt uses a lot of no name colors. You just can't describe them. The best you can say is that they were kind of anonymous grays or muddy colors, but they're not mud. They affect an ambiance. They're extraordinary colors. So that was my feeling. It changed me very much. So very, very personal. The use of color for every, I think every person that paints, if they wish it, or they can be, I'm not putting it down. One can accept the ideas about red being this being cool, that advancing. Hue can do, all the hues can advance, recede, hot, cold, temperature, all of them can do that. So you have to discover these things.
Maybe you can add, in addition to color, thinking, can you talk a little bit about how you think about figures and figuration within this, how you
Sure.
construct your work?
Sure. Well, the first thing is that I'm attracted to figures because of the sensuality that affected me since I was a child. Bodies, not just bodies of human beings, but of other objects, trees, animals, bodies. The physicality is extraordinarily moving to me. And the reading of bodies, how you receive them. So with human beings, the bodies speak. Every gesture speaks, and you know internally what a person may be feeling by the stance that their bodies take. And so it's much easier to express what I mean by using the gesture that indicates lamenting, sadness or grief, how the body turns into itself, what gestures people make with their hands, holding their heads, how they turn in on themselves. When people are recumbent and sleeping, what an extraordinary change in the gesture of reclining. Again, not acting in the world, but now simply reclining within the world. And the body takes on this interesting flow that is different than when one is walking. Aggressive walking, and the stride, all of this tells you of the internal spirit of the person. And so the figurative physicality is sensual always, but communicates as a language that we do understand because we know how to approach people, generally speaking, because of how they present themselves in their bodies, their gestures. And so I was really taken and still am by that. What I have understood is in making images, you don't have to rely on what we call realism and naturalism. One can use the general concept of a gesture and in a figurative way, 3 arms in an image or making a figurative image out of paint. If you understand the gesture that you're after, then the way one can make a figure can serve your purposes very efficiently. I can give an example of an artist who has done it very well. It's Picasso. It's perfectly obvious that in the cubistic paintings, how much they move people. And it's the geometrizing of the figurative image that creates a kind of feeling that is quite internal in the effect. And I would suggest, apart from the look of it, very physical and very moving. And if one thinks of the Guernica, a favorite work of mine, when you see the way he manages the figural images, that is the animal images, etc., the expressiveness of the gestures are extraordinary. And that's what you can do with gestural imagery, figurative imagery. And once I understood that, then I could not be bound by the canons that tend to always be realistic or naturalistic and mimicking the real world, what we call the real world. Remember this, everything that happens to us is an effect upon us. And so what we call the real world is a series of effects upon our bodies. And a painting is also in the real world, and it presents itself differently, and it's an effect on our body, and it's a real defect. We're not talking about an image mimicking and looking and referencing another. We're talking about an experiential effect. I hope that's clear.
I think, I mean, that is clear, and that kind of leads on to maybe what can be the last question that we'll ask before you kind of open it up to other questions, and that is that you often speak about the importance that the viewers of your works engage in close looking. So maybe if you just speak a little bit more about that and how you envisage the relationship between the maker, you, and the viewer.
All right. Well, what I realized, back to the viewer, that I'm the first viewer. My requirement in the maker as the first viewer is, what is it I want to see? What am I trying to communicate that is not verbal? Now, the second thing is, I'm not making puzzles. I think may be puzzling, but not a puzzle. It may be puzzling because it requires time to see what it is as it is. So everything in what we call the real world is not necessarily obvious at first. It is, in many cases, returning to a tree or an animal and beginning to see clearly what was not at first perceived. I remember when I was a child going to the St. Louis Zoo, and I liked animals, that physicality thing. I'm very, very impressed by their physicality. But the more that I went, For instance, looking at the gorilla, I began to see just things about its anatomy, its body, that I hadn't paid attention to. The change in its fur to its skin, how it folded, or with a horse, how its bulk was held by such thin ballet legs, the muscles in its neck, its hindquarters, and the flexing of it, and its skin shimmered when it wanted to get rid of flies, how its tail moved, all these things had to return again and again, how its hooves fit to the earth. It was just returning. I took some time. Well, when I make a work, it must satisfy me. It's not that it has to be complex, but if what it is requires many things, then that's what it should have. If it requires a few things, that's what it should have. If some things are more obvious in terms of visually being focused more clearly than others, it doesn't mean it's a puzzle. It just means that give it some time, and that which is not as prominent will become clear to you. And so that's the time that one hopefully will take when in works that require it. Now it's up to the viewer. If they're patient with their own eyes, the eyes are certainly not prejudiced, but the head is. Many people think that they ought to be able to sum up and in some way package your work. The last thing I'm trying to do is package your work. It's focused, but not packaged. And the reason it's not packaged, if it's dynamic, it can't be packaged. And I hope they're dynamic. That is, that the effect upon the person is vital. And that's what I mean by dynamic. I hope that was a good answer.
That's a great answer. Yeah, I think they've all been great answers, actually, Oliver. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jessica, do you want to open it up to questions?
Sure. I say just to remind people that if they have a question, go ahead and type that into the Q&A. We do have a few. This one is in depth, so it's a little bit long, but I'm going to read it as it's written here. So Oliver, can you talk about the manner with which you seem to compose forms in dense, shifting, figurative moments that seem to often tap into planar, flat spaces? There's more. It seems the effects of that flat space shift from flat to unmodulated yet atmospheric, as if the forms impose a dynamic equilibrium into the planar space and thereby cause those spaces to transform into a different sensibility.
I think I
What
got
do you
it.
say to that? Got it? Okay.
It's one that it's a good question. First, the planar space is just a canvas surface, okay? And when it's blank, if one stares at it, it's not a plane so much. A wall is much more planar than a canvas. If one stares into it, it's a problem that I think when you're a beginning painter or a person with a blank sheet of paper, is that it can mesmerize you in the sense that there are no boundaries except its parameters. You can get lost in it without a mark. And any mark placed on it changes the dynamics of it immediately. Now, if you conceptually want to hold on to the planar concept, and you do not see that every mark changed the dynamic effect on you, then you're overriding what the eyes see and the effect with a concept that is flat. It is obvious that it's flat in terms of physicality, but not effect. So any mark changes the dynamics of the visual effect. And so it's quite easy to shift back and forth between, and this is important, two-dimensionality and three-dimensionality, but they're visual effects, not planar flatness as a wall. When I say two-dimensionality for painting, that's a shift into a plane existing within a field. See, this is an interesting visual language. You can make, and painters like, a good example is Boogie Woogie.
Mondrian.
Brown.
Mondrian.
Mondrian. He does it all the time. On the surface of a canvas, he will make two-dimensional effects upon the surface, not flatness. They literally are planar within the field that is the painting, okay? That's a good example of two-dimensionality itself as an effect apart from the surface of the canvas. Now, is that clear? That part should be clear. The next thing is that you can shift it immediately with a transition, and the transitions are tricky, from that kind of effect to a three-dimensional effect in which volume, whether soft or geometric, can shift right from a planar one. And those are the dynamics that create great emotional shifts within the viewer. This change of the world. I think I've answered the question. I think I have. The idea of linearity, and that was mentioned, is a kind of concept about lines. But usually when one speaks of linearity, apart from the mechanics of marking, we're talking about form being created, usually that has to do with distance, using the line to indicate here and there, doing something round. And so it can be done with shading or with lines. But I don't know why. It's a preference. I don't know, both of them can make powerful form. A Rembrandt can use a stunning amount of lines, and Matisse one or two, and they will achieve volume, mass, near, far. I don't see a problem, you know, or a distinction between what this use of a mark that we call linear. It has no limitations in creating mass, or form, or weight, or near and far, as well as tonality, etc. So I don't know if I've answered that well enough for the viewer. I hope so.
You have actually, they just commented and said, thank you, that was great. So you must have answered the question. Yeah. I do have another question here from the audience. They're wanting to know what projects you're currently working on.
Well, now, I was just talking to Simon about a transition to come and talk on Zoom from a project that I'm currently working on. What it is a large figurative sculpture with many, many figurative forms and plant forms that are brought together in the most absurd way. I did this. This is really hard on me. And I'm trying to harmonize it. And the scale is, I think the final dimension in height will be about 8 to 9 feet. And the width will be about 9, 10 feet, something like that. And it's constructed in wood. It's got to be painted. I hope it turns out to be sculpture. Now, I want to be clear about it. I know I can make an object, fine, but will it be sculpture? If it's sculpture, then it will make a place for itself in terms of a human being, that is not like anything else, regardless of the referent images. It will be a place of contemplation for experience that is different than all the other three-dimensional objects in the world. I hope I can make that happen. That's what I'm looking for. And so all the aspects, the parts, I've got to find the harmony to get to that place. That's the one. Hope I answered that question.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's actually going to be our last question because we're just about out of time. So I just want to thank Hannah and Simon and Oliver. This has been wonderful. I really, our audience has been very excited to hear from you. So thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to everyone out there who has joined us to listen today. If you'd like, we have lots of other programs at the museum, or not at the museum, for the museum on Zoom. If you'd like, register to join us on Thursday, October 28th at noon to hear curator Amy Torbert explore works of art included in the exhibition Art Along the Rivers, a bicentennial celebration, which just went up recently. You can register for that program and more at slam.org/events. And Thank you all and have a great evening.
You guys take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.